Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And now, on with our story time. Chapter 4. At the Schooner's Rail. That night, land was sighted after sundown, and the schooner hove to. Montgomery intimated this was his destination. It was too far to see any details. It seemed to me then simply a low-lying patch of dim blue in the uncertain blue-gray sea. An almost vertical streak of smoke went up from it into the sky. The captain was not on deck when it was sighted. After he had vented his wrath on me, he had staggered below, and I understand he went to sleep on the floor of his own cabin. The mate had practically assumed the command. He was the gaunt, taciturn individual we had seen at the wheel. Apparently, his temper was evil towards Montgomery. He took not the slightest notice of either of us. We dined with him in sulky silence, after a few ineffectual efforts on my part to talk. It struck me, too, that the men regarded my companion and his animals in a singularly unfriendly manner. I found Montgomery very reticent about his purpose with these creatures and about his destination, and though I was sensible of a growing curiosity as to both, I did not press him. We remained talking on the quarter-deck until the sky was thick with stars, except for an occasional sound in the yellow-lit forecastle and a movement of the animals now and then. The night was very still. The puma lay crouched together, watching us with shining eyes, a black heap in the corner of the cage. Montgomery produced some cigars. He talked to me of London in a tone of half painful reminiscence, asking all kinds of questions about changes that had taken place. He spoke like a man who had loved his life there and had been suddenly and irrevocably cut off from it. I gossiped as well that I could of this and that. All of the strangeness of him was shaping itself in my mind, and as I talked I peered at his odd, pallid face in the dim light of the binnacle lantern behind me. Then I looked out at the darkling sea, where in the dimness his little island was hidden. This man, it seemed to me, had come out of immensity merely to save my life. Tomorrow he would drop over the side and vanish again out of my existence. Even had it been under commonplace circumstances, it would have made a trifle thoughtful. But in the first place was the singularity of an educated man living on this unknown little island, and coupled with the extraordinary nature of his luggage, I found myself repeating the captain's question. What did he want with the beasts? Why, too, had he pretended that they were not his when I had remarked about them at first? Then again, in his personal attendant, there was a bizarre quality which had impressed me profoundly. These circumstances threw a haze of mystery around the man. They laid hold of my imagination and hampered my tongue. Towards midnight our talk of London died away, and we stood side by side, leaning over the bulwarks and staring dreamily over the silent, starlit sea, each pursuing our own thoughts. It was the atmosphere for sentiment, and I began upon my gratitude. If I may say it, said I, after a time. You have saved my life, sir. Chance, he answered. Just chance. I prefer to make my thanks to the accessible agent, I said. No, thank no one. You had the need, and I had the knowledge, and I injected and fed you much like I might have a collected specimen. I was bored and wanted something to do. If I'd been jaded that day, or hadn't liked your face, well, it's a curious question where you would be now, right? This dampened my mood a little. At any rate, I began. It's a chance, I tell you, he interrupted, as everything is in a man's life. Why am I here now, an outcast from civilization, instead of being a happy man, enjoying all of the pleasures of London? Simply because 11 years ago, I lost my head for 10 minutes on a foggy night. He stopped. And, I asked, that's all. We relapsed into silence. Presently he laughed. There's something in this starlight that loosens one's tongue. I'm an idiot, and yet somehow I would like to tell you everything. Whatever you tell me, I responded. You may rely upon my keeping it to myself. He was on the point of beginning, but then he shook his head doubtfully. Don't, I said. It's all the same to me. After all, it is better to keep your secret. There's nothing gained but a little relief if I respect your confidence, and if I don't, well. He grunted undecidedly. I felt I had him at a disadvantage, had caught him in the mood of indiscretion, and to tell the truth, I was not curious to learn what might have driven a young medical student out of London. I have an imagination. I shrugged my shoulders and turned away. Over the taffrail leant a silent, black figure, watching the stars. It was Montgomery's strange attendant. It looked over its shoulder quickly with my movement, then looked away again. This may seem a little thing to you, perhaps, but to me it came like a sudden blow. The only light near us was a lantern at the wheel. The man's face was turned for one brief instant out of the dimness of the stern towards this illumination, and I saw the eyes that glanced at me, which shone with a pale green light. I did not know then that a reddish luminosity, at least, is not uncommon in human eyes. The man came to me as stark inhumanity. Dark figure, with eyes of fire, striking down through all of my adult thoughts and feelings. And for a moment of forgotten horrors of childhood came back to my mind. Then the effect passed as it had come. Simply an uncouth black man, a figure of no particular import, hung over the taffrail against the starlight. No danger to me. Then I found that Montgomery was speaking to me, and I had not been listening. I'm thinking of turning in, he said. If you've had enough of this, that is. I answered him with a grumble. We went below, and he wished me good night at the door of my cabin. That night I had some very unpleasant dreams. The waning moon rose late. Its light struck a ghostly white beam across my cabin and made an ominous shape on the planking by my bunk. Then the stag hounds awoke and began howling and baying, so that I dreamt fitfully and scarcely slept until the approach of dawn. Chapter 5. The Man Who Had Nowhere to Go. In the early morning, this being the second morning after my recovery, and I believe the fourth after I was picked up, I awoke through an avenue of tumultuous dreams, dreams of guns and howling mobs, and became sensible of a horse shouting above me. I rubbed my eyes and lay listening to the noise, doubtful for a little while of my whereabouts. Then came a sudden pattering of bare feet, the sound of heavy objects being thrown about, a violent creaking and the rattling of chains. I heard the swish of the water as the ship was suddenly brought round, and a foamy yellow-green wave flew across the little round window and left it streaming. I jumped into my clothes and went up onto deck. As I came up the ladder, I saw against the flushed sky that the sun was just rising, the broad back and red hair of the captain, and over his shoulder the puma spinning from a tackle rigged onto the mizzen spanker boom. The poor brute seemed horribly scared and crouched in the bottom of its little cage. "Overboard with them," bawled the captain. "Overboard. We'll have a clean ship soon of the whole bilin', all of them." He stood in my way, so that I had perforce to tap his shoulder to come on to deck. He came round with a start and staggered back a few paces to stare at me. It needed no expert eye to tell that the man was very drunk. "Hello," he said stupidly, and then, with a light coming into his eyes, "Why, it's Mr. Prendick," said I. "Oh, Prendick," he said. "Shut up, that's your name, Mr. Shut Up." It was no good answering the brute, but I certainly did not expect his next move. He held out his hands to the gangway by which Montgomery stood talking to a massive gray-haired man in dirty blue flannels, who had apparently just come aboard. "That way, Mr. Shut Up," roared the captain. Montgomery and his companion turned as he spoke. "What do you mean?" I asked. "That way, Mr. Shut Up. That's what I mean. Overboard with you and sharp. We're cleaning the ship out, cleaning the whole blessed ship out, and overboard you go." I stared at him, dumbfounded. Then it occurred to me that this was exactly the thing I wanted. The lost prospect of a journey as a sole passenger with this quarrelsome sot was not one to mourn over. I turned towards Montgomery. "Why, I can't have you," said Montgomery's companion. "You can't have me," said I, aghast. He had the squarest and most resolute face I had ever set eyes upon. "Look here," I began, turning to the captain. "Overboard," said the captain. "This ship ain't for beasts and cannibals and worse than beasts any more. Overboard you go, Mr. Shut Up. If they can't have you, you go overboard. But anyway, you go, with your friends. I'm done with this blessed island forevermore. I've had enough of it." "But Montgomery," I appealed. He distorted his lower lip and nodded his head hopelessly at the gray-haired man beside him. This indicated his powerlessness to help me. "I'll see to you presently," said the captain. Then began a curious three-cornered altercation. Alternately, I appealed to one and another of the three men, first to the gray-haired man to let me land, and then to the drunken captain to keep me aboard. I even bawled entreaties to the sailors. Montgomery said never a word, only shook his head. "You're going overboard, I tell you," was the captain's refrain. "This is the law. I am the king here. At last, I must confess." My voice suddenly broke in the middle of a vigorous threat. I felt a gust of hysterical petulance and went aft and stared dismally at nothing. Meanwhile, the sailors progressed rapidly with the task of unshipping the packages and caged animals. A large launch, with 2 standing lugs, lay under the lee of the schooner. and into this the strange assortment of goods were swung. I did not then see the hands from the island that were receiving the packages, for the whole of the launch was hidden from me by the side of the schooner. Neither Montgomery nor his companion took the slightest notice of me, but busied themselves in assisting and directing the 4 or 5 sailors who were unloading the goods. The captain went forward, interfering rather than assisting. I was alternately despairful and desperate. Once or twice, as I stood waiting there for things to accomplish themselves, I could not resist an impulse to laugh at my miserable quandary. I felt all the wretcheder for the lack of breakfast, hunger, and a lack of blood corpuscles take all the manhood from a man. I perceived pretty clearly that I had not the stamina either to resist what the captain chose to do to expel me, or to force myself upon Montgomery and his companion. So I waited passively upon fate, and the work of transferring Montgomery's possession to the launch went on as if I did not exist. Presently that work was finished, and then came a struggle. I was hauled, resisting weakly enough, to the gangway. Even then I noticed the oddness of the faces of the men who were here with Montgomery on the launch. But the launch was now fully laden and was shoved off hastily. A broadening gap of green water appeared under me, and I pushed back with all of my strength to avoid falling headlong. The hands in the launch shouted derisively, and I heard Montgomery curse at them, and then the captain, the mate, and one of the seamen helping him ran me aft towards the stern. The dinghy of the Lady Vane had been towing behind. It was full of water, had no oars, and was quite unventilated. I refused to go aboard her and flung myself full length on the deck. In the end, they swung me into her by a rope, for they had no stern ladder, and then they cut me adrift. I drifted slowly away from the schooner. In a kind of stupor I watched all hands take to the rigging, and slowly but surely she came round to the wind. The sails fluttered, and then bellied out as the wind came into them. I stared at her weather-beaten side, heeling steeply towards me, and then she passed out of range of my view. I did not turn my head to follow her. At first I could scarcely believe what had happened. I crouched in the bottom of the dinghy, stunned, and staring blankly at the vacant, oily sea. Then I realized that I was in that little hell of mine again, now half swamped, and looking back over the gunwale. I saw the schooner standing away from me, with the red-haired captain mocking at me over the taffrail, and turning toward the island, saw the launch growing smaller as she approached the beach. Abruptly, the cruelty of this desertion became clear to me, for I had no means of reaching the land, unless I should, by chance, drift there. I was still weak, you must remember, from my exposure in the boat. I was empty and very faint, or I should have had more heart. But as it was, I suddenly began to sob and weep, as I have never done since I was a little child. Tears ran down my face. In a passion of despair, I struck with my fists at the water in the bottom of the boat, and I kicked savagely at the gunwale. I prayed aloud for God to let me die. And this, my darling, ends our reading for today. As always, have very sweet and creepy dreams. Good night.